Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Spencer. I'm the Sales Director of BMI, and today we are going to be running a webinar, which is how to increase your student enrollments from Indonesia. So let's get this thing started. So as I mentioned, we've got some absolutely fantastic experts for you here this afternoon. We've got Jackie Castine, the founder and managing director of Jackfruit Marketing. Now, some of you might have read Jackie's report for Indonesia already, but you may have seen her market report on Vietnam, very, very popular, and also Mexico. And some of you may even have seen her market reports for the tier 2 cities in China that were produced with BMI a couple of years ago. We've got Rupert Merrick, our Antipodean College. Rupert is the Chief Strategic Officer for BMI. Then we've got Isa Rizki. Rizki's all the way in Indonesia, so we appreciate her staying up late for this session. And lastly, we've got Dr. Ishan Kader, Director of Consultancy for Times Higher Education. That's THE Consultancy, a real expert in the field of TNE for Indonesia. So a great selection of people, a lot of interest. And so without further ado, let's get started on the webinar. Jackie.
Great. Thank you so much, Spencer. Yes, indeed. This is the fourth report or so that we've co-produced since we started working together about 5 or 6 years ago. And we'll pop those links into the chat for you as well, just to make sure that you've got those handy. And also just to give you some context, we are going to talk today about Indonesia and a little hint of Vietnam and Southeast Asia trends. And of course, when you're looking at recruitment strategies, the first place to begin is always with good market intelligence. But just to give you some context, at Jackfruit Marketing, we do a lot more than that. We also guide our clients and our partners on their international marketing and branding strategies. And we also look at creating strategic plans to increase your enrollments in key markets. We create market campaigns and slogans. We write a lot of content for various channels. We build and enhance websites. We advise on lead nurture strategies. We help you build personas and customize content for them. We work with ambassador programs as well. There's quite a lot, but today let's focus specifically on Southeast Asia. Now, when we look at emerging markets in the context of student recruitment, we're looking for a few telltale signs for international enrollment potential. So we'll start with the very basics of a booming youth population. Now, here, Indonesia's youth demographics far surpass Vietnam's. For example, at a macro level, we know that Vietnam has more of an aging society, and the youth population is expected to rebound a little bit, though, and reach up to 22 million Vietnamese by the year 2030. So right now, or at least as of around 2016, the 15 to 24-year-old population group in Vietnam made up about 17% of the population. Meanwhile, over in Indonesia, over 40% of the population is under the age of 24, and that is over 110 million young people. So based on the sheer market size alone, we can see that Indonesia is in a different class. And we know that international admissions teams all around the world are on the lookout for the next China, the next India, the next Nigeria. And when you see these numbers coming out of Indonesia, you can really see that it's a market with enormous potential. Now, this is also a market where tertiary education is not quite the norm. Only a fraction of the adult population has a bachelor's degree. But as the country evolves, that trend is changing. As of last year, 26% of the 19 to 24-year-old population across the country was enrolled in higher ed. Now, for reference, World Bank cites some different percentages for university enrollments, just to give you some context. So, for example, in Malaysia, 42% of university-age students are enrolled in higher ed. In Thailand, 49%, China, 51%. So it's an indicator, but it's just one of many things that we would consider when going into a market. And in Indonesia, again, the potential is really clear here to increase those education attainment levels, to draw more links between education and employment, and also to improve the quality of education at home and the quality and variety of courses that are offered themselves in Indonesia specifically, because we know that many students, if they can't find the program they want at home, that's what's going to drive them to look elsewhere. So let's look a little deeper at the recruitment hunting ground within the country. Now, if you're recruiting at the undergraduate level, a natural place to look is in the international schools market. There are 195 of them across Indonesia, but note that due to a regulatory change in 2015, they are referred to as intercultural schools or independent or intercontinental schools. We don't call them international schools in Indonesia. Now, given their global outlook and the need for education reforms at home, many of the students that are leaving those intercultural schools will be considering higher education overseas. And we know that they're coming from affluent families, so they are typically full fee paying students. Meanwhile, you've got students coming from the mainstream state schools that tend to be a little bit more price conscious. So they're going to be looking at the overall affordability of a destination and the tuition fees. Families are saving up since their child was born, and they're applying for government scholarships as well. We'll have more on that later. Now, for students who choose to stay in Indonesia, they have one of six choices. There's universities, and there's 81 state-owned public universities. Entry to those is highly competitive. Then you also have your institutes, tertiary colleges, polytechnics, a small handful of local community academies as well, which are kind of like training centers that will give a diploma 1 or 2 level, almost the equivalent to an associate's degree, if you think in those terms for a comparison. But the higher education sector is rather complex. For example, there's also four types of universities in Indonesia based on ownership and how they're managed, such as being state owned, ministry based, those managed by religious councils, or those that are private. Now, you can see in that chart the enormous number of private providers, and they are said to be of dubious quality, which can account for the low tertiary enrollment levels in the country. So this gives you a better understanding of why Indonesians are looking for tertiary options abroad. And we also see that clearly need to improve teacher training and the quality of education, especially in the private sector at home, both to service the next generations of young people, but also for company employees continuing professional development and training, particularly to support the economic growth, which leads me to my next point. So we'll look at some other ingredients for an attractive source market, such as a growing middle class. In Indonesia, that's weighing in at 55 million, projected to exceed 86 million by 2030. And as we evaluate a country, we also look at historical and projected growth. So for example, Vietnam and Indonesia, they rank very highly with a strong GDP growth forecast, let's say about 5% for the year ahead. Now, Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world by population, as we know. It's the 16th largest by GDP, but only 25th largest by exports. So the goal is to become a high-tech based manufacturing hub and really leverage its position in the middle of those global shipping lanes. And I'd encourage you to see the additional reading section of the report because there's a lot more research and articles on the topic of how to bolster middle class income growth and also the correlation between income, education, and rising wages in Asia as well. So it stands to reason that if Indonesia is going to reach these economic growth targets, it will need to upskill its population and get more school leavers into higher ed. And as those incomes rise, so too does the demand for education abroad. And we'll see the number of outbound students at different varying levels from Rupert in just a moment. But before we sign off, I would be remiss if, as a marketing company, I didn't give you some marketing tips. So, first up is that many institutions in your messaging, you like to talk about how students will feel at home when they live or study with you. But it's important to illustrate that via real examples that you can proactively use in your recruitment tactics and in your messaging. Paint the full picture of an Indonesian community that can act as a support network for them so they can socialize together, but also integrate into your wider university community. And be mindful of images in your marketing that focus too heavily on crazy parties or sports. We've all seen those images of incredibly enthusiastic football fans with letters painted on their bare chests and beer cups in hand. And that might appeal to a certain student population, but for the Muslim Indonesian culture, doesn't quite gel. So it's important to find a more balanced way to showcase parties by all means and fun campus experiences, but in a balanced way. And if your institution is located halfway around the world, it doesn't need to feel like that. Create a bond between your culture and theirs. Next, when promoting your institution, be sure to highlight programs that have a direct correlation to the needs of Indonesia, particularly around the construction of its new capital city, its economic growth, improving that education at home, those high-tech fields that are so in demand, and also climate change, environmental management solutions, those kinds of subjects. So rather than leading a conversation with your institution's story, perhaps start by promoting your best programs that align with student interests or that give your institution a strategic advantage over your competitors or what's offered locally or regionally. Now, next, given price sensitivities from Indonesians who are not in that top income tier and their strong family ties, you might see more success by concentrating on short term exchanges or summer or winter programs as opposed to a full degree abroad. And we're also going to hear soon as well about lots of different options for TNE in the region, as well as dual degrees and so on. But this in turn will give you some time to build up success stories from Indonesian students and parents who have experienced your institution and your campus and can then act as a brand ambassador for you going forward. And gradually you'll start to plant those seeds that Indonesians can come abroad and go abroad for a lot longer as well. So our contact details will be given to you as well at the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along. We're going to turn now to Rupert, who's going to talk you through some of the variances on undergrad and postgrad trends in destinations.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Jackie, for that overview. Hello, everyone. My name is Rupert Merrick. I'm the Chief Strategic Officer at BMI. Okay, I'm going to jump straight in. Now, we want to start off by looking at where young Indonesians are studying around the world. Now, it's always tricky to get consistent data when aggregating outbound student numbers for many different countries. UNESCO is one of the widely quoted sources, but they often underreport the numbers of tertiary students abroad. However, for some countries, it's really the only readily available source that we can find. So for countries like Egypt and Turkey, we've used UNESCO as that source. But for the most part, our good friends at Jackfruit Marketing have worked really hard to search the internet and go onto many different ministries of education websites from around the world and individually compile and tally up all this data. So what they're estimating is that there are over 84,000 Indonesians studying abroad in over 50 countries around the world, which makes it a much larger student market than many would imagine. As always, though, with international education stats, there's always stories within stories. And I'm not going to lie, there's some pretty intense graphs coming up, all of which are available in the main Indonesian report that BMI and Jackfruit have published. So should you wish to examine them in a little bit more detail, please give it a download and spend your time going through those numbers. So let's move to firstly Australia, my home country. So Australia is by far the long favorite for Indonesians when they're looking to study overseas. When you look closely at the 20-year history, the numbers have been very consistent, showing gradual growth. That is unless you're looking at the vocational sector, in which case there are clear success stories there, with 135% steady growth over this 20-year period. Then jumping across the ditch to our friends in New Zealand, prior to COVID, NZ's numbers were growing strongly and totals reached just over 1,200 in 2019. We do, however, expect the Kiwis to work hard to recover those numbers. And now that things have returned to normal, the 22-23 figures should be more in line with those long-term growth patterns. Moving to the US. Now, if you look at the US, the total number of Indonesians in 21-22 was just above 8,000. Meanwhile, back in the early 2000s, those numbers were as high as 11,500. After those initial highs, the numbers dipped, but then began to grow again and more or less plateaued as we moved towards the COVID era. But digging deeper into the various sectors, there has been an underlying change in the course makeup of these figures. It was hoped in the Obama days that due to his childhood link with Indonesia, it would create renewed interest in American education. But during the Obama years of 2009 to the end of 2016, postgraduate enrollments pretty much remained flat. However, undergrad did climb up from over 4,600 to just over 5,800. Yet since then, undergrad enrollments have fallen back slightly to practically where they were around 2011. So any gains that may have been enjoyed over that period really now need to be re-earned. What has been working really well for the US, though, is OPT. Those temporary work rights have been doing well at attracting more employment-savvy Indonesians with an especially good run of numbers since 2016. But this is an important point. Unlike other markets in Asia or Africa, Indonesians are not looking to emigrate overseas. It's a family-orientated culture, and for the most part, they do plan to return home after their study abroad period. So just looking at the UK, it's hot here in the UK today. In a similar pattern to the USA or Australia, we've seen the postgrad sector seesawing quite a bit in the last 8 years, but there has been a strong bounce back post-COVID. Meanwhile, the UK has seen strong, steady growth for Indonesian undergraduate enrolments, which is another strong signal of a growing market. Being able to obtain a bachelor's degree in 3 years opposed to 4 like in the US is just one of the factors contributing to that growth. So what we're seeing, if you look across the classic higher ed destinations of Australia, US, and UK, is a fairly stable performance with some interesting growth stories along the way, such as wins for Australia in the vocational sector, gains for the UK undergraduate sector, and a big post-COVID jump, and a solid win for American OPT numbers. Now, this is where it gets really interesting when we start looking at the intra-regional growth across Asia. China, for example, we're seeing about 15,000 Indonesians studying in China. That's thanks to economic ties between the two countries and increasing investment from China into Indonesia, especially in the infrastructure sector. China's affordable tuition and living costs, as well as scholarship programs for prospective graduate students from the ASEAN region. Plus, there's a strong Indonesian Chinese community that helps drive overall numbers into China. Big Chinese wealthy populations have been there for many generations. Let's look at Japan. Higher education enrollments of more than 1 year and language programs have been growing, apart from over the COVID years. Indonesians are expressing significant interest in learning Japanese language and culture and spending longer periods of time there. Globally, if we look who's learning Japanese, the Chinese are actually the #1 market, with Indonesia being #2. The Indonesians are choosing it as elective languages in their high school years, and they're following anime and manga, getting onto those great things with the Chinese culture. And when they go to Japan, they're wanting to live the language and take advantage of the economic ties and career prospects. Interestingly, we saw similar trends in another report that BMI and Jackfruit produced from Vietnam. Anecdotally, though, both markets are seeing that bounce, partially as well because off the back of the opportunity to work whilst they're there studying language. Malaysia has been slipping in Indonesian enrolments. The most recent number we found was 9,874 compared to the 10,400 in 2017. But the country is nearby and has strong cultural similarities and an affordable cost of living. So it really should hold its own against other destinations in Asia. Taiwan, another interesting story here, whose Ministry of Education reported that Indonesia is the 5th largest sending market for Taiwan. There were nearly 5,000 Indonesians in Taiwan's universities in 2018, a total that has more than doubled in the last decade. And the number of Indonesians in South Korea is likely to grow higher than the reported 1,078, given the amount of investment that Korea is making in Indonesia and its strengthening ties. Pop culture there is huge as well, with the whole K-pop phenomenon taking off in Indonesia, like most places around the world. So with a bit more research, that UNESCO number that we're quoting here, we really do expect that to be higher in the future. So at BMI recruitment fairs in Indonesia, we partner with the Ministry of Education to hold these events. We're seeing strong growth in both visitor numbers and exhibitors. We're also seeing, though, a wide variety of interest in destinations across the board. Indonesians are globally curious and receptive to hearing you explain the benefits of your programs and destination. They're not coming in with a fixed mindset of one country over the other. They're definitely looking around to see what the opportunities are. So this slide shows you the visitor stats versus those publicly recorded enrollment figures that I was just talking to. It's important to say, though, this is an apples for apples comparison as we intentionally market destinations that reflect the universities who exhibited our event. It is, however, interesting to see what students are attending an international recruitment fair are looking for. I also just wanted to cover off 2 more destinations which are popular with Indonesians, Canada being one of them. Canada has seen a steady growth from Indonesia. They've seen smaller numbers than many other English-speaking countries, though. but we can expect Canada's enrolments to continue to grow. As we know, the country's popularity with foreign students from pretty much every major sending market has been phenomenal over the last decade, and Canada continues to be the belle of the ball at the moment. The Netherlands as well has strong historical ties with Indonesian communities and has a large population living in Holland. They've contributed to a pretty steadfast rise of enrolments over the last 15 years, but with the closure of NESO offices overseas and the issue around student accommodation and government legislation, it's going to be really interesting to see how those numbers hold up. Just a quick word on language skills before I wrap up. Whilst language learning is commonplace for many middle-class and upper-class Indonesians, it isn't mandatory in state schools. And as Jackie mentioned, the country is aiming to improve quality education at home. So it's reasonable to imagine that Indonesians not coming from an intercultural school could benefit from some form of academic English prep, particularly for postgraduate level. Moreover, those coming from secondary level vocational schools and then heading on to tertiary vocational institutions overseas will also likely need some ELT support. All in all, the EAF reports the above average English levels in the main cities you want to focus your recruitments on in. And that's especially seen in Surabaya and Jakarta, where they've really got some strong English language levels. But look, in summary, the appetite for study abroad in Indonesia is clearly growing. Interregional mobility trends and a broad base of destinations are soaking up some of that growth. But with the economic fortunes and the ballooning youth demographic which Indonesia is facing, being the fourth largest country in the world by population, Indonesia will become a major source of students over the next 10 years, and one that will continue to grow definitely as we move forward. And I'd like to finish by saying, I think many universities are overlooking Indonesia when it comes to proactive recruitment. I think now's the time to reevaluate the market, and because it's the work that you put in now which will pay off over the years to come. So that's enough from me. I would like to call on my colleague Asya, who's joining us live from Indonesia. Take it away, Asya.
Thank you, Rupert. Okay, so we've been talking about Indonesian students, Indonesian youth. So we need a representative here, right? So nice to meet everyone today. I'm Aisa. I'm currently working as a project manager in BMI. I'm working locally here in Indonesia. It's currently 10 p.m., but I'm really happy to show the study abroad opportunities and also the students and also about everything that I know. So I'm deeply passionate about education and study abroad, where I share my experience, my knowledge to 2,000 students, Indonesian students on social media. And in 2021, I had this amazing opportunity to study as an international student in Galway, Ireland through Indonesian government scholarship program named IISMA. Okay, getting to know Indonesian students. So when we're talking about Indonesia, we are a very multicultural country. We have 300 ethnics, we have 700 languages across the country, and we are a very proud Muslim country. But if you haven't been here before, we are far more modern than you think. And building on what Jackie has said, we are a very youthful community, and this is adding to the changing on the dynamics in the country. And in Indonesia, we are very multicultural and we are a family-oriented culture. When we are making decision, we tend to make it collectively, especially when we want to study abroad as a student. We want to also including our parents, our family in making the decision. And Indonesian students, they want to study abroad, they want to enhance their employability both domestically and internationally. That's why they have been wanting to pursue their higher education abroad. This lead to the massive growing appetite for studying abroad, which also followed by the support from the Ministry of Education. They provided a lot of scholarships that we will discuss later. Here are the social media that Indonesian are using. We have WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, everything. But when we are really zooming in into what really happened in the field, most of the students, I made a poll on my Instagram, they use Instagram for the first, and then followed by TikTok and Twitter. And of course, we need to take parents into account. I have seen a lot of parents, a lot of the older generation, they are very active on social media. Even when I saw my parents' phone, my auntie, uncle phone, they have this social media. They have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. But when we are really looking into what they use it for, Facebook, they mainly use it for interaction with their colleagues, family. But for Instagram and TikTok, they have it too on their phone, but they mainly use it as a consumer. They tend to look for content and information, and WhatsApp for the messenger. And I heavily say that parents are really actively involved in the decision making process, and they are using the social media as one of the source of information. And how can we communicate with the students, especially on social media? Okay, first of all, I recommend for the photo selection using representative of Asian hijabi as for your ads or advertisement brochure, as it can give the sense of diversity and also welcomeness for Indonesian students, as if like they see like, oh, I see my person in that picture. It can give the feel of home for them. And second of all, look at running different social media campaign with creative aim at students and parents. Even though we are messaging to students, they want to study abroad, we also need to make sure that the content can be also be digest with the parents too, as they are also using the social media to know like their children want to study abroad. And as I have been sharing content for the past 2 years every day, I found that the contents with the highest engagement are about the tips and tricks on preparation, English proficiency tests, lifestyle abroad, because these Indonesian students, they want to know how it really looks like when they want to study abroad, how it looks like, the culture shock, they want to prepare for it. So you can also use this as your content for social media. And last but not least, I'd say consider on using influencers. Indonesia has a lot of young influencers, especially those who are concerned in education, careers. You can also use the students who already studied abroad as an alumni, or students, Indonesian students who is currently studying abroad. They tend to share a lot of content to their friends through their social media. So they have this pool of audience targeted on people who want to study abroad. And I can say that the influencers in Indonesia, they have a relatively lower rate. So you can consider on using this strategy on your marketing. Whilst many Indonesians do self-fund their international studies, as a scholarship student myself, I want to quickly run you through the scholarships that are provided via the Ministry of Education. And for your information, Ministry of Education is the patrons of BMI and TNE event in this October, and they are encouraging students, Indonesian students, to study abroad by providing the LPDP scholarship, Beasiswa Pendidikan Indonesia, Beasiswa Indonesia Maju. These are for the postgraduate, undergraduate, and PhD. And we also have the short-term program. This is the one that I went for Ireland. So Indonesian International Student Mobility Awards, or ISMA, for undergraduate students to study abroad for 1 semester. And we also have the bridging course for master's degree for final year student, where we can have the free IELTS test, URE, GMAT, and not only the Ministry of Education who are providing the scholarship, we also have the Ministry of Communication and Informatics scholarship. They just launched this scholarship this year for postgraduate. And I might just add that if you're looking to connect to the Indonesian Ministry of Education, they will be actively involved in the BMI Indonesia events in this October, and they travel each year to BMI Global Scholarship Summit in London. And the country is developing rapidly, and I hope you get a feel about how rapidly the country is growing and how important study abroad is to my generation. And last but not least, I want to very welcome you to Indonesia, and I hope to see you in this October in the BMI event. And up next, we have Ishan, who will share about the TNE information.
Thank you so much, Aisha. Hi, everyone. My name is Ishan Kader, and I'm Director of Consultancy at Times Higher Education. I lead on our consultancy's transnational education and internationalization services, and I have the great privilege of working with many universities and government ministries around the world on their TNE and internationalization strategies. So I'm just going to share my screen And just first of all, I want to really thank my fellow panelists, Jackie and Rupert and Aisha, for some really great insight into Indonesia, and hope that you've all been enjoying the session so far. So I'm going to talk about TNE in Indonesia and really use the UK as a case study to understand the trends and opportunities that we have in Indonesia. First of all, just to define transnational education, I'm very much using the UK's Higher Education Statistics Authority definition of TNE. So this is where a student is studying for a degree at a university outside of the university's home country. Typically, where there are a number of different models of TNE, we've got the international branch campus, which tends to be the headline-grabbing TNE model, but also we consider joint and dual degrees, franchise and validation agreements, as well as online learning as forms of transnational education. So turning to TNE in Indonesia, just a few points to kick off with. First of all, Indonesia is one of the top 5 priority markets for UK transnational education as defined by the UK's international education strategy. Indeed, we have an international education champion, Sir Stephen Smith, who is kind of pioneering our efforts to expand TNE in these markets. Overall engagement with Indonesian students is still relatively low for the UK. Rupert had some great statistics earlier on that. However, for Australian universities, Indonesia is in the top 10 source countries for both onshore and offshore recruitment, offshore there being the equivalent to TNE. So in October 2018, the Indonesian Ministry of Research, Technology and Higher Education passed regulations to permit the development of international branch campuses in Indonesia. Monash University from Australia was the first to do so. And we have news that Deakin University in Australia and Lancaster University in the UK will shortly be developing a joint IBC in Indonesia. Nonetheless, other forms of transnational education, such as joint and dual degrees and online learning, at the moment remain more popular in terms of TNE activity within Indonesia. Sorry, my screen is just frozen in terms of moving between.
Now, these things do happen. There's a slight technical hitch, and I'm just going to fill in whilst Ishan sorts his technical thing out. As soon as you get to the next slide, I'll sign off, but it's worth noting. There we go. Ishan, you're back on.
Sorry about that. So yeah, just a bit more context about TNE in Indonesia. Of course, Jackie talked about this earlier on, but where we have TNE development, it's often because the government wants to internationalize the domestic higher education sector, improving the quality of higher education, its capacity, as well as the choice available to students. And if we have a quick look at its neighbor, Malaysia, Malaysia is one of the 3 most successful TNE hubs in the world, and over the last 30 years has really used TNE to support its internationalization and improve the quality of its domestic higher education sector. There are a few challenges that exist for TNE in Indonesia, not least a law that requires any foreign branch campuses to be non-profit. Nonetheless, with a large, growing and youthful population, and to an extent limited disposable income for foreign study, TNE in Indonesia is a potentially attractive and sustainable choice for foreign universities in the future. So just to go through some facts and figures of UK-Indonesia, UK TNE activity in Indonesia. In the 2021-22 academic year, there were 950 new enrolments for UK TNE in Indonesia, which is the highest in the last 5 years. Overall, there's 62 UK universities that operate TNE in Indonesia, but just 2 of those had more than 200 enrolments in 21-22. And those 2 universities account for over half of all UK TNE in Indonesia. 47 UK universities had less than 10 enrolments. And overall, only 7 UK universities provided TNE in a model other than distance or online learning.
Just a reminder, if you want to put any questions in into the Q&A box, in the chat box, we'll happily attempt to answer those questions towards the end. So feel free to put the questions into the Q&A and we'll get those covered at the end, together with any details on the poll that we conducted as well.
So this next slide, I just wanted to show you what the UK transnational education activity was in those top 5 priority markets. I've kind of deliberately left out the names of the countries here, but just to let you know that those top 5 priority markets are Saudi Arabia, India, Vietnam, Nigeria, and Indonesia. And on this chart, what we see is Indonesia is actually the lowest of the UK TNE activity, right at the bottom there. We've got Saudi Arabia at the top. In the orange line is India. In the grey line is Vietnam. That's grown quite sharply over the last 5 years. Yellow is Nigeria. And as I say, Indonesia has grown over the last 5 years, but a relatively flat rate and is still quite low compared to those other priority markets. So I would see that the UK has still quite a lot of work to do in ensuring those transnational education enrolments increase over the next few years. I also just wanted to contextualize UK transnational activity in the broader ASEAN region. And in the 10 countries of ASEAN there, what we see is overwhelmingly UK transnational education activity is strongest in Malaysia, Singapore, and increasingly in Vietnam as well. Now, the data from these top 3 countries kind of skews the way the graph looks a little bit. So if we take out Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam and have a better idea of how those other 7 countries are performing, we see that Myanmar is leading amongst that second tier group, although it's had slightly inconsistent TNE over the last few years. Indonesia, in the grey line there, what we see, it's in the last 5 years, it's moved from a position where it was closest to Brunei's activity, which is obviously a country much smaller, and has increased sufficiently to now reach approximately where Thailand is. So although Indonesia's overall TNE recruitments are still quite low, what we can see is in the context of the ASEAN region outside of Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, it is starting to improve and it is performing relatively well. So I think this bodes well for future opportunities. Just a quick look at how the TNE activity in the region kind of divides by undergraduate and postgraduate enrolments. For Indonesia, there is a majority of TNE enrolments for undergrads, around 60%. So this is quite different from the context in Thailand, Philippines, Cambodia, and Laos, where TNE activity is still weighted more towards postgraduate enrolments. Now, one thing that we talked about at the beginning of TNE was the different models. And I think this is really interesting. What we've done here is break up the different models of TNE that's delivered in Indonesia and compared it over the last 3 years. In both cases, what we see is that distance or online learning makes up the majority of UK transnational education in Indonesia. We've got collaborative degrees in the lighter grey and red. So these could be joint or dual degrees, which are created in bilateral partnerships between UK and Indonesian institutions, or they could also mean where UK institutions have franchised their degrees through private Indonesian providers. Nonetheless, what we can see in these last 3 years is that overwhelmingly TNE growth has been stimulated by the distance and online learning model. Why this is important is it means that a growth in distance or online learning does not necessarily mean that that's been stimulated by partnership creation. It could, for example, just be down to good marketing from UK universities in selling their online degrees to individuals in Indonesia. So this does mean that there is still scope for further university partnership development in the TNE space in Indonesia. And I just want you to keep an eye on the dark grey box, which signals distance and online learning. Because if we compare then the activity to other countries in the region, I've selected Myanmar and Thailand here because they're relatively similar in terms of enrollment numbers to Indonesia, but I've also put in Malaysia and Singapore as those kind of leading markets. Myanmar is a bit more similar to Indonesia. It's still got a lot of distance and online learning, but in Thailand, we see that collaborative degrees is much more common in terms of the TNE model. That indicates to me that the partnership development between universities is potentially at a slightly more mature stage in Thailand, even if the overall TNE enrollment numbers are relatively similar. In Malaysia, distance on online learning is very popular, but we've got a new color there for international branch campuses in yellow. We see that that makes up around 20% of provision within Malaysia. TNE is also very popular in Singapore, but again, distance and online learning is one of the more common models there. I should say that there are international branch campus registrations in Singapore as well, but it's a relatively a smaller figure, and that's why it doesn't come up. So just thinking through some of those opportunities that exist in Indonesia, as I said, at the moment, it's only Monash that are operating an IBC in Indonesia, but we expect very shortly for Deakin and Lancaster to open up that very unique bilateral joint campus. For the UK sector, Indonesia is at the moment the weakest performing of those priority countries, so there is really good scope for further development there. In terms of the ASEAN market broadly, it is catching up with Thailand and Myanmar, but it is quite significantly behind Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. And we see that within Indonesia, UK TNE growth has mainly been stimulated by distance and online learning, and even that largely through just 2 UK universities. So there is a lot more scope for UK partnership development with Indonesian universities, especially around joint and dual program creation, facilitating greater recruitment into TNE programs. And indeed, I know that that is one of the key things about the BMI event in Indonesia is precisely to stimulate those partnership development opportunities with UK and Indonesian universities. So before handing back to Spencer, I just want to quickly reiterate that if you are interested at all in Times Higher Education's transnational education services, please don't hesitate to get in contact. My contact details are on the final slide of this presentation, but I am now going to hand back to Spencer and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kader. Some fascinating insights there. As I said, I'm Spencer, Sales Director of BMI. So let's talk about some of the opportunities that we've got for actually getting to this wonderful country. So many islands, so little time. Start with a bird's eye view. Looking at the geography of the country, it's an island nation. Over 17,000 islands. And I've just gone to the slide before. There we go. Yeah, so 17,000 islands, all beautiful, but sadly not all possible to visit on a recruitment trip. But don't let the island vibes fool you. The country is modernizing quickly. The number of Indonesians shifting to urban areas is expected to reach 71% of the total population, or 209 million people by 2030. So we've chosen the 3 best cities to focus your recruitment on based on a number of factors as discussed, and also for the travel logistics to make the tour as straightforward and hassle-free as possible. We'll be in Jakarta. This is the country's capital, cultural, political, economic center. It accounts for approximately 17% of Indonesia's GDP. Jakarta is home to the University of Indonesia, the oldest institution of higher learning in Indonesia. We're also going to be in Surabaya, a city situated in the northeastern section of the island above Java. It's Jawa Timur's capital, Indonesia's 2nd largest city. It's a business center influenced by industrial growth due to its role as one of the busiest ports. We're also in Medan, situated on the coast of Sumatra, and is the capital of North Sumatra province. Medan's a major economic hub, and its proximity to Singapore and Malaysia has played into its economic advantage. But how are we going to be able to get you in front of these people? Well, we have a series of events taking place. The first one that we were talking about earlier on is about meeting students and, crucially, meeting their parents before. We got tips from Aisha about how important the parents are in making those decisions. So the parents will be coming along to those fairs as well. You'll have an opportunity to meet thousands of students who are ready to study at our fairs, and at the same time, we're going to be visiting top high schools in those cities to complement the activities. So we'll be able to go into these high schools, these intercultural schools, I've learned something, and be able to do mini fairs there. In addition to that, we'll be running the Indonesia International Schools Forum and Workshop. This is something extremely important for high school counsellors in those intercultural schools. We'll be gathering together with all of the schools that you can see listed here, and over a period of 2 days, universities will be having meetings with these schools to tell them about their institutions and to establish links with these important counsellors. So that's taking place on the 1st and 2nd of November. And then we also have the Indonesia Higher Education Workshop. Now, Dr. Ishan Kader has been speaking about the TNE opportunities here, and certainly this is a place where you can expand on those. We can see that the top universities in Indonesia are already participating in this. So there's plenty of opportunities to, over a period of 2 days, have those meetings with these universities and really start to generate relationships that are going to generate students further down the line. So a lot of possibilities there. They're all on this little list here. You can see the dates of what we've got coming up. Of course, this is in regard to BMI's other fairs which are taking place all around the world, but this focus on Indonesia, you can see at the end of October and the beginning of November, really good opportunity for you to be able to go in to meet the students, to meet the parents, and also to meet the universities and to meet those high school counsellors. It'll should make a considerable difference to your flow of Indonesian students coming in. So thank you to our presenters. I was particularly impressed with Aisha. I think it's important to realize that she's so good at the presentations because she has over 200,000 followers and does social media updates every day. I've got 7 followers on Instagram, so I'm not very good there, Aisha. I'll have to do some learning from you. So let's take some questions. I know that there was an interesting one from Sam Whiteside. So Sam Whiteside says, what's the current UK in-country representation model like? Are many universities from the UK seriously looking at having staff based in country? So what's the current UK in-country representation model like? And are many universities from the UK seriously looking at having staff based in country? Who would like to take that? Well, from a panel of experts, I'm putting Rupert.
I'll jump in there. This is very much anecdotal, Sam, but I know of at least half a dozen UK universities who have some form of reputation there. It is building. You know, Australians are there in force. I think every major Australian university has people on the ground. From the Brits that I know, it is a mix of full-time people who are just focused on the Indonesian market. Other people are using Indonesia as a hub for Southeast Asia to do the recruitment. And then you also see the informal mix of various alumni coming in. I haven't seen any sort of Sanam 4 type models there where you're getting Brits sort of setting up in sort of like a serious structured way. But I definitely think that that's going to grow as the numbers do.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Rupert. A little follow-up question from Sam. Do most recruitment activities focus on Jakarta and Surabaya? Are there any interesting outlying cities worth exploring and marketing in? I think, Jackie, would you like to take that one? And maybe Aisha afterwards?
Yeah, sure, thanks. And definitely take a look through the report because we do mention a few, I think 6 cities there. Bandung is a really popular one for tourism, for creative industries, and there's also about 50 higher education institutions there. And that's in a convenient spot located in between Surabaya and Jakarta. So that would be fairly easy for you to work in, let's say before or after some of your visits. But also what we've done in the report is we've shown you some of the population by province as well. So again, if you're sort of looking at mass numbers of youth population, take a look through to see where else are some of those hidden pockets and matching that up with some GDP growth as well. Keeping in mind that some of these provinces might be starting from a very low base. So if you see a huge jump in GDP growth, you need to dig a little bit deeper as well. It might be, there's more to that story than just a flashy 10% type of a figure there. But certainly looking through the different strategies as well across the country. Maybe if you're in Medan, you want to also combine that with a visit up to Singapore even, and looking beyond Indonesia itself as more of a Southeast Asia tour in and of itself. And of course, that's why BMI has organized things going into Vietnam, for example, and combining some of that. But always encourage you to go deeper than just the primary cities. And it depends also on your maturity in the market. If you're just getting started, then you do want to stick with those core cities. But if you've been there for a long time and you feel like you want something a little different, then, again, just like you do in any other major market, going deeper in.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Aisha, would you like to add anything onto there?
Yeah, I totally agree with Jackie. So Medan is like the city that is like almost next to my city, my hometown right now, and they are the cultural hub. They have a lot of students in there, and definitely worth to look up. And also Bandung and the other outlying city, we also have Makassar in Sulawesi Island. It's worth looking, and also like as Jackie said, we need to look also deeper into what is like really in there and what is like the potential before coming there.
Yeah, I do see a lot of institutions visiting Denpasar and Bali as a recruitment ground, partly for undergraduate recruitment because there's a high concentration of some really, really high-end international schools. Great place to visit as well. But that's one. And another one that comes up in conversation quite a bit is Yogyakarta.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rupert. So we were talking earlier on about how Indonesian students are traveling in large numbers to the region. And a great question here, anonymous attendee, but says, would Indonesian students take part in short-term experiential and skills-based programs offered in South Asia nations like Nepal and Bhutan if such programs were offered by Western institutions and include Western students and professors? Would they go even if it was a custom program for just Indonesian students but offered by a highly engaged and well-supported international firm working in coordination with the Ministry of Education of Nepal and the Ministry of Education in Bhutan? Aisha, do you think that the Indonesian students would go for that?
Definitely. As an ex-Indonesian student and also as someone who has a deep relationship with them, I talk a lot with the students, and most of them they really want the exposure of going abroad, having the experience to study abroad, and also like even though it's only a short-term program, especially for those students who already have their undergraduate in Indonesian university, they want to look up to those short-term experience, like what the anonymous attendee said. It's the experiential skills based programs. I think it's definitely worth a try, but I recommend to also making the marketing. Indonesian students, we have a lot of students community, so I'd recommend looking to the students community where you can give the information to them, and to make sure the informations are spread to all of the students in Indonesia. I think this kind of programs are really welcome to Indonesia.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aisha. So we're going to go to Jackie and talk about the results of the poll in a second. But just before we do that, we got I think we'll do one last question. With the scholarships on offer, are these available to all applicants? Are there any prerequisites for UK universities to be recognised to accept these? Are there lists that people need to get in?
Yeah, Aisha,
So,
maybe you want to take that on the scholarships question, or sorry, I wasn't sure which one, but
yeah, absolutely. So with the scholarships on offer, are these available to all applicants, or are there prerequisites for UK universities to be recognised to accept these? Aisha, with the process of getting your scholarship, was there a registered list that you could go to, or and how do people get on that list if there is one?
Okay, so for the scholarships program in Indonesia, it is available for all students, but we have this really rigid, and also like the selection is almost like nano filter. So the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Informatics, for example, LPDP scholarship, I think all of the scholarships, they have their own selection process, which we have to make the essay, and we have also doing the interview, but they have two process. One is the one who already have the letter of acceptance. We don't have to go through the test. But the second one is for us who is not enrolled yet to any university. We have to do the some sort of academic test. So we have Indonesian government, they have their own system when it comes to scholarship.
Mm. And Sam, just picking up that question there, I think if you're looking at how to get on these programs, yes, you do need to engage with the Ministry of Education. They do have a certain criteria about which institutions would fit the programs. And you do need to engage them to do all the paperwork and get on those lists. Some of them are ranking sensitive, others not necessarily. Yet we do have contacts with this ministry. They're actually the patrons of the event, and they'll be giving presentations, and they'll be involved in our Indonesia events for side discussions with institutions. The Ministry of Education of Indonesia actually fly up to our London event where we do the BMI Global Scholarship Summit, which is really designed to bring institutions together with various governments so they can talk just about these issues. So yeah, there's a bit of elbow work to do to get in and engage and advocate with these programs. But once you're in, they're actually quite large, these programs, to fund the best and brightest of Indonesian students to go abroad.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Rupert. I know that Dr. Ishan Kader, you need to head off in a minute, but you would just wanted to add something regarding the universities setting up outside of Jakarta.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. This is just in relation to the question about kind of understanding different areas of Indonesia, and it also applies to TNE, I think, as well as recruitment. I know the government for the setting up of foreign branch campuses has mandated particular special economic zones for that development, and I think there's 3 or 4 outside of Jakarta that would be interesting to scope, and I really encourage universities to either conduct more market intelligence or spend that time getting to know places outside of let's say the more obvious destinations within Indonesia to think about that TNE, just because the market is so emergent, and I think it's a very interesting time to understand that quite diversified but very very promising space within Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Ishan. And we realize that you might need to head off in a minute. So we're going to speak to Jackie, and we're going to finish off with the results of the poll. Jackie, how are we doing?
Excellent. Thanks, Spencer. So, yeah, I think, the real message is variety, isn't it? It's diversity. It's an incredibly diverse country, and it's important to have a diverse strategy as well when you go there. So, looking at your direct to student marketing techniques, going into market, especially whether it's to meet with scholarship providers and ministries, or your high school counselors, really being seen in the market is important. And so we did ask, how many of you are planning to go after we've whet your appetite so much? And we see that most people do have some plans to go, the majority kind of looking to go this year or next year, but there's still a few of you who aren't quite sure yet, and 2 people who don't have the plans. So maybe we need to convince you a little bit further. Make sure you get those reports in front of the powers that be. Also, how much experience do our guests, our attendees have in the market? We see that most of you are fairly in the early stages. Maybe your institution's been recruiting there for a while, but you're personally new. So I hope that we've given you a good oversight of what the market is like and where to sort of focus some of your energies when you're getting started. And also in terms of which programs our attendees are recruiting for, we see a good mix of undergraduate and postgrad, just a little bit for vocational and ESL as well, which is, again, kind of speaks to the diversity of what's on offer in the country. So having that real rich mix and making sure from a marketing perspective as well that you're customizing your approach for different audiences. The messaging and the way you position your institution when you go into an intercultural school with highly global, highly affluent families is going to be very different than the messaging you're going to take into a fair, for example. So don't be afraid to experiment. It will be different in different cities and certainly different for different types of students, personas, and partners as well. So that's kind of a few final thoughts from me, Spencer.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jackie. Well, We come to the end of this webinar in association with BMI, Times Higher Education and Jackfruit Marketing. Thank you for participating, and we'll see you in Indonesia.